Wait, dude, we're not in space.
Fuck. You guys turned the fucking space on. Assholes. Anyway,
Hey guys, welcome back to Overtly Critical. I'm Corwin.
I'm Ryan.
And this week we watched Interstellar, directed by Christopher Nolan, which is my personal favorite movie ever made. It gets better and better each time I watch it. I think for this episode, this is now the 5th time I've seen it. And just to start off, you might tell that my voice is kind of shitty right now, and that's just because I got kind of sick, so bear with me, folks. Sorry for the horrendous audio on my part.
He had a really, really good weekend. That's all I'm going to say. Interstellar, this is our second Christopher Nolan venture. We reviewed Christopher Nolan film for our second episode ever, which is Memento. I really liked Interstellar. And I said this more the second time, despite it being a long movie, I never feel like it's long. There's a lot of long movies that you really feel it. I didn't really feel that in this one because I was so into it. And Christopher Nolan's really, really good at manipulating time, especially, or at least using it, exploiting it, which is great for, any story or any screenplay. And I think there's a lot of things you could praise about this movie, especially visually. But honestly, I think the strength of this film is its writing.
I mean, like I said, this movie is my favorite movie ever because to me, it's just, it's such a great expression of the human spirit and the power we have to go on and rise above our limitations. And to me, I think this is probably his magnum opus, Christopher Nolan's magnum opus, because it takes his obsession with time and storytelling to the highest degree, because Chris Nolan understands that time is the master dimension of our lives, and everything bad that happens to us is a product of time limiting us.
Yeah.
And that is what this movie is all about. And the characters they're so human, they're so well written, the stakes are so understandable and relatable, and they stand to lose literally everything. Yeah. The world is going to end, but they have the potential to gain so much to, bring the human race out of the nest and live in space and, defeat our, overcome our fate. And I just find this movie so deeply inspiring.
And the thing about the movie too is, despite how complicated it gets, it's a very, very simple concept. I mean, there's problems on Earth. It's becoming less inhabitable. They got to find a new home. That's basically your premise. And they need this former pilot to help them do it, even though he's a farmer.
Right off the bat, the opening shot of this movie is just brilliant, with the dust in the bookshelves, just calling back to the end of the movie, and that's the secret is in that room, and that's how they communicate and solve the problem. But also, I really like how they characterize Tom and Murph in the beginning, and it sort of sets up through dialogue and how they both interact with their dad differently, how they're two different people. Yeah. Tom is he's more practically minded. He's a bit blunt. He's kind of just accepting his life as is. And Murph is this very inquisitive, smart kid who is actually kind of solving the problems before Cooper does, or pushing him to investigate further. Yeah. She's the one who is investigating the room and finds the coordinates and gets Cooper interested. And I just think it's a pretty good way to do it because I think it's mostly done through dialogue, just the way they talk to each other.
I really like about this movie that the two main environments in the film are this rural farmland and space. I find them to be very, very good. They're very similar in some ways, where it's a lot of just open land and openness, yet at the same time, rural farmland is this very primitive thing, whereas space is this very high-tech thing, or at least our exploration of space is. And I really thought that was kind of interesting, where but he's also an explorer there, and he has this big land there, and in space it's more open. It's not really that deep of a thought, but I just like the contrast of those environments a lot.
I think it does a lot to reinforce the theme of this movie, which is that eventually, whether we like it or not, this planet will die. Whether it's, due to us being unable to maintain it, or some natural disaster, or eventually when the sun just explodes and devours our planet. If the human race is to survive, we have to find another place to live.
And there's also an environmental similarity with when they're on that first planet and there's that big wave. It's almost very visually similar to like the dust storms, almost exactly, and it looks the same. And that's a very little detail, but I think there's a little bit of a moment there where, you know, Matthew McConaughey's character might have been thinking that too, like, holy shit, it's like another one of those fucking dust storms. It's like the same thing. And that made me think about how really this film is, it's kind of man versus man, but there is a lot of man versus nature in this. It's more the idea that man versus nature isn't even a fight. It's, we can't do anything about it, really.
Yeah. It is like that quote, though, that the younger Dr. Brand says, that nature isn't evil. It's just inevitable that, you know, this is going to happen. I think you could probably make a case against the message of this movie that, you know, we probably should be doing more to maintain our planet, because that's kind of a big cultural debate right now in our world of, do we spend money trying to go to the moon again? Do we, you know, you get people like these billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, and from a certain perspective, it looks like these are the people who have destroyed this planet through industry, and now they're trying to go colonize Mars. And that's a fair point, that we probably should be doing more to protect this planet. But I think the movie isn't trying to say that it's not worth protecting the planet. It's just giving an example where we already failed to do that. And it's just about, in a wider sense, that human perseverance.
Yeah. I really liked that in this film, kind of like Memento, he's very, really good at subjectivity and storytelling, where Memento might have been a little more obvious, but even in this case, I really thought it was interesting how we're following characters who are literally on different timelines, but they're still intercutting, and the plot beats are still working at the same time. That was really well done. So obviously in this film, when Matt McConaughey's character Cooper goes onto this mission, he quote unquote stumbles into NASA. He goes on this mission, shit gets complicated because they got to go through a black hole. So, and obviously being in space and working with gravity and all these things, time becomes different. And I think that obviously in every script, time is important for, you know, making effective drama and suspense. But I think in this film, with one scene in particular, but really the entire film, because you know time is working different on Earth, and because you know Cooper really wants to get back to Murph, everything is so much more consequential, because for everything that's happening on the ship or on these planets, it's years back home for his kids. And so that's what this film, the center of the film is really the father-daughter relationship. And it's so well done at putting you into Cooper's headspace as so many years are going by on Earth, but it doesn't feel like that to him. It's almost like watching his other life without him, if that makes sense. It's like he's watching his world grow up without him, because he should be part of it.
There are two scenes in this movie that made me cry the first two times I watched it. Now I only really cry at one scene in this movie, but they both deeply affect me. And the first one is where, after they have the shit go down on Miller's planet and they lose 23 years, they get the messages from home. I love that what they do with that for most of the movie up to that point. After Cooper leaves, we don't ever cut back to Murph. So he does a great job with the script, Christopher Nolan, of really making it impactful just how much time has passed by putting us into Cooper's headspace. And then for the rest of the movie, the second half, we are cutting between Cooper and Murphy, and seeing them both try and solve this problem together and eventually coming together to figure it out.
It's also because when she messages him, that's basically about the time she figures it out. So that's where it makes sense to start back with her. One thing about that scene, not to jump around though, one thing with that scene that I really liked is how when he's watching his son's videos, there's this like score, and then as soon as his videos end, the score just cuts. And it's like, oh shit. And then Murph's video comes up. But so I will say this film, because it is about, you know, not exactly cyclical time, but the idea of the future already existing, that sort of thing. It's probably the best possible way to do setup and payoff in a film. And I know you had said that about Roger Rabbit, but I think like in this case, it's a little different in that it's this idea of kind of like how nature is inevitable. It's like this entire film is inevitable because the pieces were put in place for it to just keep happening and happening, and this happens because it had to happen, and then I make it happen. There's a lot of that in this film. Which I think makes the setup and payoff that much more brilliant. Because like when I'm watching this film, I'm not even thinking that ghost is going to be Cooper. But then when I rewatch the film, I'm like, God, it's so obvious. It makes so much sense. And that's why this film is, I'm not going to say it's a twist, but it sort of acts that way, where he gets into the Tesseract thing and he's seeing all these past moments in time, and it's sort of this moment where your brain, and any good movie does this, when it's just all of a sudden, as soon as you see that, you just connect all the details and you're like, oh, it all makes sense now. I think this film did a really good job at that.
I really like that this film sets up gravity and this idea of them as a mystery that has to be solved.
Who's they?
Because this stuff it feels pretty unscientific at times, like this idea that there's just this weird gravitational anomaly, or that these people put a wormhole here, and you're kind of thinking that's a little too perfect. Why is this happening? And by the end of the movie, in that climactic scene in the Tesseract, all the pieces fall together and you understand that this is the human race, God knows how far into the future, fulfilling like fate and setting things up and continuing the cyclical nature of time. There's a lot of philosophy to be read into this movie, and science.
Sure.
There's an entire book written on the science of this movie. Interesting fact, the CG model of Gargantua, the black hole, at the time this movie was made, was the most scientifically accurate model of a black hole ever made. And what's cool is if you look at the photos that NASA took of the black hole in our galaxy, I don't remember what it's called, it looks pretty damn similar. I mean, it's kind of blurry, but it looks like how Gargantua looks in the movie, because they were that precise with their scientific accuracy. But with the philosophy of this movie, it's this idea that time is cyclical and that the future exists and that things are predestined to happen. Because if you are a person who could exist in 5 dimensions, if you could treat time like a 3-dimensional space, then you could see what the future has to hold.
Right.
And that's very interesting. There's a lot of questions this movie has about fate.
Yeah, I would say on the human level, the other kind of philosophical struggle that really defines the plot of this film is the idea of sacrifice and the idea of doing things for the greater good or doing things for yourself. And this film actually, I noticed this a lot more the second time, because obviously the big thing in the film is the only way that they get Cooper to go on the thing is to convince him that it'll save his kids. It's totally a personal reason. And then we find out later that Dr. Brandt was kind of manipulating everybody because he said, fuck Plan A. It's not going to work. Plan B is just easier to do it. We're not going to save anybody. And so he had to motivate people with self-interest to do something for the greater good. But I really, really like that sort of in the end of and then they come across that man character, although you could argue that he was also being selfish, but still, where he's trying to argue for these more like, you can't worry about your personal attachments. But then at the ending, when Cooper finally gets back to Murph, she tells him, no, like, go, what the fuck's Anne Hathaway's name?
Brand, the other
Oh,
Dr.
fuck.
Brand.
Well, I don't remember her first name, but
Amelia.
Okay, but he ends up going back to see Amelia, which is purely a personal thing to do. So it's like the film is totally motivated by these personal interests, but it's the personal interests that actually inadvertently save humanity.
You're hitting the nail right on the head here. The second theme of this movie, aside from time and the future of humanity, is love and how love motivates us to do things. And there is this great sort of debate in the movie, throughout the movie, of whether you should do something for love or do something selflessly. But what happens in the movie, like with Man's character, is Man is a character who has no attachments. He ends up being a complete coward, and he makes really stupid decisions that screws everyone over. Where Cooper, who is motivated almost entirely by his love for his kids, is the one who makes the selfless decisions, like throwing himself into a black hole to get the data so that his kids can live. And on a wider scale, it's also this idea that the people in the future are doing these things for people in the past. It's this idea, and I don't really know how much I agree with this scientifically because I don't know it, but this idea of love crossing dimensions, whether it's based in science or not, the symbolism is very strong.
That's sort of their thematic
Yeah.
story way to do that. But yeah, that was kind of interesting to me this time, where the whole film is about like, oh, you know, whether it's a greater good or not, but then eventually these characters following their love and their personal desires actually is what ends up setting everything right.
Another reason I really like this movie is I find it incredibly immersive. I talk about pretty much every sci-fi movie that we watch on this show, how good a job they do of creating an immersive environment, because that's the speculative fiction I'm generally drawn to. Right off in the first act, what I really like is the subtle world building they do to set up this future. There is no exposition dump. There's no long conversation that they have that really gets into what happened. We just get pieces that we can sort of form a greater picture with.
Right.
Like how at some point they dropped bombs on starving people to do population control. That there's no military anymore because that people are so desperate to survive. A really cute detail I like is that in the baseball game, I didn't see this until the first time we watched it together. So for the 3 times I watched this before, I never noticed this. That's the fucking New York Yankees.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. It says like world famous New York Yankees in just this little small town fucking Rust Belt baseball stadium that looks like it's a high school baseball game, because that's just how many people are left in the world.
Yeah, the parent-teacher conference scene is also pretty revealing, too, of sort of the fate of his kids' generation. That was probably one of the most interesting scenes to me, because actually it almost gave me, like, Truman Show vibes of, like, we can't let kids think they can explore.
Yeah.
We have to tell them that they can't.
Another thing I love with the world building of this movie is just the realism of the technology. Like, it's just the overall design of everything, but one thing that really stands out to me is the design of the robots, Tars and Case and Kip. That's so unique and creative. It's awesome. It's like it's not even like they didn't even rip off Boston Dynamics, which is what a lot of like modern sci-fi does. They created a totally unique design for a robot that is totally believable and fun and creative.
Something that I really liked is that despite the fact that they're totally designed for utility and not to look like people, there's one of my favorite little moments in the film is, I think it was when Brent went to sleep and he was like trying to whisper to him or whatever, I don't know, but at the end of that conversation the shot holds, is it Tars?
Yeah.
The shot holds on him, which is like totally a thing that like cinematography will do to a person. It's showing that conversation that that Tars had with Cooper is resonating with him, and it was really weird because it does not look human at all, but the way it's shot makes him appear to be human, if that makes sense. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, I remember that scene.
It's like when they walk away and they hold on him, he turns and looks at him like, that's how they shoot people, and that was really weird. It was jarring, but I liked it.
The robots are often used for comedic relief, but it is kind of crazy how much you come to care about, like Tars especially. I get very happy in the movie where like they recover him from the black hole as well, and Cooper fixes him up, and like this idea that like they live together on the farm now.
There's one detail I really liked about the film. One scene in particular sort of fulfills 2 previously mentioned things. The final scene, or not really final scene, but when Cooper sees Murph on her deathbed, that is not only looks exactly like Murph seeing Dr. Brent on his deathbed, but also that in the film a couple times, man repeats this idea, you're going to see your kids before you die, or they totally flip that where Murph sees her dad before she dies. It was just a really nice little they were able to tie that together in that one scene. I thought that was interesting.
Man, that's the scene that never fails to make me teary-eyed. It's just so emotional to me.
I mean, I guess we can talk about the performances in this movie because I think we should. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure Matthew McConaughey probably got a lot of praise for this performance. My favorite bit of performance in the film is when he falls into the Tesseract, and you can hear like the genuine like fear in his voice, like when he's like, like, because he has no fucking clue what's happening, and he's totally like, he's just as confused as the audience is, and you can sense the genuine fear of the unknown that he's experiencing, and that moment really stood out to me, especially because there's no other sound.
Yeah, it's the pure cosmic horror of space and being totally out of a place you should live in. A performance that really stuck out to me is actually the actress who plays Murph as a kid.
Oh, yeah.
I had never thought about just how good a job that kid did with that performance. Because it never comes off as grating. It doesn't come off as fake. It's fully believable. And, man, when child actors pull off a performance, it just makes a movie. Because, you know, kids are generally not great at doing anything. So if a kid can act well and like can act just as well in a scene as an adult actor, especially a veteran actor like Matthew McConaughey, props to that kid, man.
Yeah. That was a good performance.
Let's talk a little bit about the visual storytelling of this movie and the technical aspects, because there is a lot of great work there. One thing that really stuck out to me with this movie, with Nolan's visual style, and something I've noticed in a lot of his work, and something that gets talked about a lot online, is he tends to light things generally with pretty harsh far side keys, and also a lot of edge lighting. Mm-hmm. And it really just does a great job of separating a character from their background. And also for the scenes where they're in space and on the Endurance, the lighting is so harsh, because in space lighting is harsh because, you know, you're basically filled by infinite negative fill. So everything around you is going to be dark except for what light is hitting you.
That's right. I like that a lot of the light was overexposed when things would fill through the windows of the ship.
And the lens flares. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the lens flares. This movie is shot anamorphic.
Partly.
Mostly. Yes. And obviously that just, you know, creates that sort of expected sci-fi feeling that we're looking for with the lens flares. But one thought I had is that anamorphic lenses kind of visually represent relativity, because the farther you get away from it, the edges get warped.
Right.
And I don't know if that's maybe reaching, but I like to think it was intentional.
Yeah, obviously another detail is that this film has aspect ratio changes, which Nolan likes to do. I think probably one of the most... And Nolan's very, very good at hiding it, too. A good example is in The Dark Knight Rises. When he goes in to fight Bane, it's 16:9, and as soon as the gate closes behind Batman, the ratio shrinks as sort of like a way to trap him. And this film mainly uses it for a lot simpler of a motivation, where it's if we're in space, or if we're in shots, usually exterior shots of the ship, there's the times where they mount the camera to the ship, mainly those shots. And if they're on planets and things like that, they use the full screen, or especially when they're going through the black hole. But when it's stuff like with Murph's story, it's all anamorphic. They never change the aspect ratio for that. And I have a little bit more I can get into it later about it, but just generally the fact that it's, even the first time when we watch the correct version, even though it's not always there, I noticed it a couple times, but I stopped noticing it because he motivates it so well. Mainly because most people don't expect aspect ratios to change because it's sort of a thing taken for granted, but when you're so involved in the story, it just makes sense that when you cut to these scenes of space, it's just a wider field of view. So it just works. And when you cut to Murph, it's a lot closer in because it's a lot more personal. It's less macro. So I think the fact that I was having a hard time keeping track of it the first time I watched it is because it's just blended so well into the story.
I really like how space is shot in this movie. because almost every shot we get in space is from a locked perspective of a camera. It's either camera locked onto something that's moving, or it's like kind of a POV shot, like over the shoulder or from the perspective of a character. And that does a really good job of grounding us in an environment that has no point of reference,
Right.
really. And the only shots that we are wide are for significance or scale, like seeing the ship compared to Gargantua or Saturn, or seeing the Endurance spinning out of control and debris flying everywhere with that great contrasting shot. It's a really good way to not only immerse the audience in the positions of the characters, but also keep us from getting disoriented in a lot of disorienting scenes. I never could quite understand why this movie affects me so much, and when we watched it a second time, I think I finally got it. There's this idea, I don't remember the name of the philosopher, but he basically he's an Israeli philosopher who makes a point that all you really need to create a myth is to have a story that extends a little beyond its own horizons. Like this idea that it's the real story is bigger than just what's being told. And to me, Interstellar is a story that becomes mythical mainly when the Tesseract happens, because when when Cooper has the realization that the human race built the Tesseract, suddenly the scope of the story just goes far beyond the horizon of its characters and the audience, and it creates this grand epic narrative about humanity. It really is a mythical story. It's like a legend, and I think there's a lot of power to those stories because they basically, it's how people tend to find purpose, is by having some kind of personal myth. And I think that really encapsulates why, to me, this movie is just the best of Christopher Nolan's work. Because a lot of people talk a lot about like Memento being a really creative, solid film, and it is. I stand by that. That's one of the best movies I've ever seen. Or The Dark Knight, which I think gets talked about a little too much. Whereas this movie is totally an original story. It's got so much significance for our own world, and it does such a good job of being inspirational and impactful.
Well, I think what helps that along too is that we are totally in Cooper's perspective. So when at the ending, when everything's revealed to him, it's revealed to us because we're only seeing his piece of that story, which I think is why that works so well. You know what they say? There's no sounding in space. Dan, it's time.
You okay?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You ready? Are you good for the session?
Yeah, are you going to do your intro?
Yeah, but you see, I already went to the fifth dimension, and I already planned this out 2 hours ago to make sure that you coughed at this exact moment so I could do my intro by giving myself subliminal messages.
Are you just using this as an excuse that you didn't write your intro?
Welcome back. All right, so I will straight up admit I did not watch this movie twice, but I watched it once. And that is,
I'm done. I'm quitting.
In all honesty, what is this movie mostly about? It's traveling to space to find a place for humanity to continue on. And as the world has kind of shown through like the futuristic digital music tech and stuff that's not big brass band, but also is big brass band, it's like space music or like futuristic music does not seem to have like its own big beat. And it can drag on for a long time, in my opinion. It's like, what do I see or play, like hear whenever I play a game about space, or I watch film that has space in it, or anything space? It's the same. It's kind of like the same theme every single time. It's like long, drawn out, heavy, out of this world.
I would say
mystery. It's supposed to sound like something you wouldn't be able to normally make.
Are you talking about the music in this movie or sci-fi music in general?
It's kind of both, and that's because this is my only pet peeve about sci-fi music, and that is there's like only like one or maybe two relative themes that sci-fi music follows as like law, and that is like where there is no need for a beat if you're just going to drag it out and have like constant strings playing, and you have like timpanis in the back of the band booming, and it's supposed to sound like emptiness. That is kind of like emptiness. You make a fast going song, it sounds like you're right there in the moment, and that kind of works in the case of, say, being sucked into Gargantua, when like you could tell the music was getting intense, but they showed intensity not through like making the beats faster, but by making the music louder.
I think a lot of the music in this movie kind of blurs the lines between ambience and
exactly
music, which is probably why it was so unnoticeable for me at certain point.
If you remember from Dark Star, they had country music out when they were flying into space, and that kind of took away the, wow, it's space, that's incredible. Like, oh, they humanized it.
Well, I mean, there is also a point in the movie where Cooper, I don't remember the other guy's name, gives him headphones so he can listen to like on-earth ambience.
Yeah.
Which is,
I think you guys are kind of missing the point of the music in this film. I really love the score in this film. I think it's masterful. Hans Zimmer is, bringing his A game as he does with every score.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's bad either. It's quite well done.
The main instrument of this soundtrack is the organ, which Hans Zimmer picked because he felt it fit the grand nature of the story, because the organ is, kind of the king of musical instruments. It's the biggest instrument there is. And it's got this holiness to it and this Baroque quality of just, it's the music of the church. And so what an organ does is with its pipes, it drones. You pull out the stops and you play on the manual or on the pedal, and it drones and it goes and it fits the length of this story and how long this journey is.
Well, right. I wasn't criticizing it. I think the fact that it sounds more like ambience is kind of the point.
Yeah.
Whereas, sort of how you had said about how the camera work, it's more static because space is static. I sort of see it as the same idea, at least to me.
I think though, like you Dan are talking a little too much about it being ambient, because there's moments like the track No Time for Caution, which is the theme that plays when they're trying to reverse the spin of the Endurance after man fucks everything. That's such a fucking fast present piece of music. It's just, you have moments like at the beginning where the score is so quiet you almost can't even tell it's there, and Hans Zimmer knows when to bring it in.
And that's what I was kind of like referring back to with what Ryan said, which like, yes, on the ambiance part, but it's like instead of a fast beat or using percussion to add impact to audio, it's kind of like, what did he do? Like, what happened during that scene especially when they're trying to, dock, I guess, like when they're trying to dock to the Endurance as it's spinning, and that's like the most intense. It's like, if we don't do this right, we're gonna die. It just makes it louder, and it just gets more intense.
I believe that every tick in the scene on Miller's planet is supposed to represent a day. I can't remember though, but it is something like every tick represents the time shift difference. It also just like subconsciously is that ticking clock that reminds us that every second is time being wasted and they've got to move fast. Another thing I love about the soundtrack in this movie is the main theme, Cooper and Murphy's theme, which is what you hear obviously throughout the movie, but it's also what you hear after he's thrown out the Tesseract at the end when like everything becomes clear.
If I'm correct on this, because I went and checked it out, I believe that theme is called Stay. As in, it's spelled S.T.A.Y, all in caps.
That might be the title of the theme, but the point I'm getting to is that score does not resolve musically because it's in the key of C, and it does not resolve on a C chord until he's out of the wormhole at the end, orbiting Saturn again. That is when it finally musically resolves, and that's just such a great like high macro level thing to do in art in a movie, is to not give us that resolution until the story is resolved.
On Miller's planet, like when they were kind of like crash landing into the water before the big wave struck, it's like they landed on like a huge crap load of debris, and not that it was like a huge or major thing in the story, but it's like that could have been done way worse, and I'm so glad it wasn't. They made the debris sound wet, and I'm not sure how.
I assume you were going to talk about this at some point. Not really much else to say about it. The fact that space does not make sound in this film, it's just such a stupid, simple detail that you'd think would be done in more films. But then again, I think that's a detail that this film does, because the point of this film is to try to say, we're trying to be somewhat scientifically accurate, take it seriously, and that's why they do that. Because it could be a lot more entertaining to hear all the explosions and things like that, but they choose not to do that.
Well, I sure am glad I made it onto the spaceship tonight to film my portion of this podcast with these guys. And this movie was very heavy sounding, and I really loved it because of it. The soundtrack is amazing, and you should go watch this movie after watching this episode 3 times.
So it's lesson time now, and Corwin's up.
All right. This movie is driven by parallel storytelling, by the dual protagonists of Murph and Cooper. And to me, this is just a perfect example of how to do that, because they both solve the problems together. From the very beginning of the movie, they are a team. That's teamwork just transcends time and dimensions and distance. And that's kind of the theme of the entire movie. But just like in the beginning, how Murph's curiosity pushes Cooper to kind of like get hope again, and how Cooper as a father instills this interest in science and exploration in Murph, and how also at the same time that they're both having their climactic man versus man moment where literally Cooper's fighting for his life against man, Murph is also confronting her brother and trying to save him when he doesn't want to be saved.
Yep.
And of course they come together in the climax with the Tesseract, where they're communicating in the room at different points in time, and she realizes, as Cooper realizes, that they've been helping each other since the beginning.
Yeah. That's what I appreciated so much about this, is like they like to say, like, 2001 has like the greatest cut ever made, which is, oh my god, it's a shitty cut. But regardless, so like the time jump, no film has ever jumped so much time with one cut. What I really like about this is like we're literally cutting between different timelines and almost I guess you could say subjective realities. We're cutting between those two things, and it really is just the power of film that we can do that. And again, kind of like you said, I like that things are happening for them at the same time when we're cutting, despite being in these two totally different places. It's really cool how it all comes together.
It is something that I hadn't thought about, really, that in most of Christopher Nolan's movies, he doesn't tell things in chronological order, and you literally would lose so much of the story's impact and meaning if you told in chronological order. Like, it just wouldn't work, because that's just, it ruins the perspective. And your lesson?
Yeah, so my lesson is understanding that aspect ratio has an artistic purpose, and it can be used that way. Because I think a lot of people take it for granted. I think also a lot of people are like, well, the widescreen is just film. Now, it is very true that the origins of widescreen tend to come from trying to differentiate from television. So it didn't necessarily have as much as a story-motivated focus when it first came out. But, early films that used it, like Ben-Hur and things like that, were like, use that widescreen. But I like that Christopher Nolan has the balls to actually manipulate it. There's a huge argument among filmmakers and cinematographers, especially about things like lens flares. Because some people are like, well, it clearly takes you out of the story because it's recognition that there's a camera. And then some people are like, no, it's perfect because it's showing perspective. I feel like there's that same kind of, could be that same debate about aspect ratio, because things like the camera or like the size of the screen are things that the viewer kind of just takes for granted because that's just the screen. But I like that he goes out of his way to show you that is something that can change, and it is something that can move. And again, aspect ratios are so jarring. I mean, you see it in movies all the time where they're like, TV shows will do like fake widescreen bars. It's like that, I feel like animes probably do that, or like
mask,
fake, or like animated shows would do that. Like, oh, it's all serious now. But I feel like in this case, it's done with so much like discipline, and it's so it's so motivated that you don't even notice it, and it just works so well, and I really like that. And it also, because he is changing it, it really makes you think, when I'm shooting something, why am I shooting it like this? Do I need to shoot it this way? What's the best way to shoot it? So that's what I really thought about.
It's one of those tools that a lot of people don't think of as a tool.
Yep.
I remember I really liked how Zack Snyder, when he remade Justice League, decided to keep it the full IMAX, because that's what most movies are shot for now, rather than basically cutting it down to like an anamorphic style and losing so much of the frame. This movie, of course, is, as well as being this great epic story about mankind and nature and space, it's also kind of a funny movie. So what better person to talk about just all the funny things with this movie than Joey? Come on, go throw us off the set and, steal the camera, lock us out of the room, and say whatever the fuck you want, because you can't stop us. I mean, we can't stop you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I have now increased my sick counter by 1. I am currently in the lead of sickness. The title is There's Nothing. I've actually stopped writing titles, but I have PTSD as the first note. This is set recorded 2.5 weeks after, so about half a week's content is now gone from my brain. But PTSD. Come on, daughter, be more like your brother. Be a dumb, simple-minded man, and you just want to work on the farm for the rest of his life. Be simple-minded. Never be complex. If you have a complex brain, your life is just going to be shittier. So literally, like, take a needle right here, get a lobotomy, bada boom. You're gonna love life more. You just gotta take out the right part and not be a vegetable. That's just all. All right, taking my daughters to school. Oh, shortcut. Left wing. Left wing. I interpret the dust in this movie as actually the reality if we all saw what COVID looked like. Women, when people leave. Men. See you later. All right, Tars is actually pretty good. He's pretty good settings, so I need to put some other settings. Tars, set clumsiness to 15%.
Kill yourself.
Also, set sex to 99%.
That's the Ryan setting.
And then set male dominance to 1000%.
Ah, the
clumsy, sex, male dominance. Corwin's dream is being put into a rocket, being sent right up to outer space and looking at all the black.
I don't even get the joke. Yes, I want that.
He wants black all around him.
I don't get the joke.
Pitch black. You know what's a good idea? Let's drop a camera in space and let it fly around, float around in space. That's how you get the good shots. Oh no, guys, we're just back on Earth, but we're in the Pacific Ocean. But you know which side we're on? We're right off the coast of Japan.
God damn it.
You know what? You see that? But I know who could beat that. Badland Chugs.
Damn that.
Mr. Matt Damon, the shit potato man.
That's
The only way to truly close the black hole is to have a suitable key for it, and I only know one person for that.
Yes!
Fucks the fuck.
He will close the 5th dimension.
Collapses the Tesseract with his girthy cock.
Well, that's Funny Notes, and I'm very excited for the many more episodes of Funny Notes that are coming in the upcoming months. There's gonna be so many episodes.
That was Interstellar. Did you get all that? I didn't.
You might need to rewatch it a couple times. You might need to rewatch this episode a couple times. We'll take the watch hours.
Absolutely. But what about next week? What's happening next week?
Next week.
Well, not next week.
Well,
What's happening in 2 weeks?
That's true. Our next episode is a movie that I'm shocked took me this long to watch, because growing up, we always had this movie on our DVD shelf on the wall, and I was always kind of intrigued by it, but I just never watched it for some reason, and I'm glad that you forced me to, because I really enjoyed it, and I think it's a great casual way to kind of cap off our season 3 for the show.
It's It's definitely a step back from some of the crazier shit we've watched this year, and it's also a little Christmas themed, and it's about time we watched Tim Burton. So until then, see ya.